Hello, travelers. Welcome to Oceans Week at Reach the World. My name is Tim, and for over 20 years, Reach the World has inspired youth to become curious, confident, and compassionate global citizens. This week, in partnership with the Explorers Club and in collaboration with ocean advocates around the world, we're sharing kid-friendly stories of ocean exploration, conservation, and wonder with members of our global community. You can find a complete calendar of live stream events and much more at athome.reachtheworld.org. Today, I'm so excited to explore an ocean topic that fascinates people, young and old, around the world. Joining us is Explorers Club member and president of RMS Titanic Inc, Bretton Hunchak. Bretton and his colleagues are joining us live from several places, including their special facility where they preserve artifacts that they've recovered from the Titanic. We're going to be talking about their efforts to recover and preserve Titanic's legacy, and we'll hear more about what it's like to journey more than 2 miles beneath the Atlantic Ocean to explore this wreck. We're also joined today by on-camera students who are eager to ask their questions to Bretton and his team. And in addition, we have a truly global live stream audience right now. If you're watching the live stream, please use the YouTube chat bar to let us know where you're watching from and what grade you're in too. That will help us know who we're hearing from. You can also share your questions for the RMS Titanic Inc team in the YouTube chat bar, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So all right, it's time to dive into the Titanic. Bretton Hunchak and colleagues, welcome to Reach the World.
Thank you guys so much. And thank you everyone for joining today. As mentioned, my name is Bretton Hunchak. I'm the president of RMS Titanic. And today I wanted to share a couple of stories and experiences for myself and my team. And I hope you guys are going to enjoy it. So very briefly, on the next slide, we talk about what RMS Titanic is, right? What is the company and what do we do? So over the past 20 years or so, our company has taken 8 expeditions to the Titanic. These expeditions have various goals and features, but the 2 most specifically we're going to talk about today are 1993 and 2000. And we have some people who were actually on the expedition who are going to share their experiences with you firsthand. What does our company do, you might ask? A company about the Titanic? Seems confusing, right? The RMS Titanic Inc. is focused on the legacy of Titanic, and we do this in a number of ways. We do research on passengers and the stories of legacy. Some of these stories are sad, some are happy, some are inspirational. And we have collections team and historians going through to try to bring those stories to people like you. We also have modern day explorers that go down to the Titanic. You're going to hear from Rory Golden, who has been in a manned submersible all the way down to the wreck and has recovered artifacts and brought them back to the surface. You're going to hear from our conservator, Jeffrey Taylor. Jeffrey makes sure that those artifacts stay intact so that people like you can see them all around the world. Basically, our goal is to consistently grow everything we know about the Titanic and share it with people to make sure that the past is never forgotten. On the, Katrina, next slide, please. Here's a few things that our company does today and some things you can enjoy at home. So while this is going to be a great experience and I hope you guys get a lot out of it, we've also tried to reach you on social media and virtual exhibitions as well. So we have museum quality exhibitions in Las Vegas and Orlando and those that tour around the world that give you a firsthand look of what it's like to really be inside the Titanic. You can see what your cabin might have looked like. You can see the glasses and plates that you guys might have used. And you can also see what some of the clothing or some of the culture was like on board. We have these experiences around the world that people have come to see, and over 30 million people have. But as of recently, we've put them all online so people just like you can log in, walk through, and experience it for yourself from the comforts of home, especially during these difficult times when we're spending a lot more time at home. So we're very excited to have these in place, and we hope that you're able to enjoy some of them. If you want to get a quick look, Catherine and our marketing team have done a great job on our Instagram and Facebook, and that has some great stories as well for you guys to log in. On our next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that we do. So it's not all excitement and going down in submarines, but we go down to collect a lot of information so we can learn more about the shipwreck. So I'm not sure if all of you are aware, but the ship itself broke into 2 pieces when it fell from the ocean surface. It left no clues really early on for us to determine what had happened. However, over the last 25 years or so, our company has aggregated information, photos, sonar maps, and accounts from as many people as possible to try and determine exactly what happened. And we're very excited that Bill Souter, who you'll be hearing from shortly, is putting together one of the most comprehensive rec reports. This rec report, don't worry, has a lot of great pictures and images, and it certainly helped me through it. The picture you're seeing on the screen right now is actually a sonar map. This sonar map might not look like much, but it took almost 2 full weeks of scanning from remote submarines with cameras and sonars attached to them to collect this. And it took a significant amount of time after for our team to interpret this data and create these images that are sort of nice to look at. To the right is a photogrammetric image. This is a collection of thousands of photographs that are laid on top of one another, and it creates an accurate 3D model of what the ship looks like. These also take a great deal of time, but they're very exciting to look at and can also be seen on some of our social media aspects. On the next slide, we have some additional information for you that is a little bit more scientific and intense, but it just shows the depth of research that Bill and his team are doing and how much we're learning even today from a shipwreck that happened so long ago. The next slide is my favorite, and I'll tell you why. This slide encompasses years of research from our teams in 3 very specific images. Some of you guys might notice that these images look pretty similar, and you'd be right. The image on the far left is the first time we took good photographs of the Marconi room. And the Marconi room is something I'll explain in a bit, but essentially you're able to see over time how those holes have widened, how some things have fallen apart, and how it looks like a dangerous situation, doesn't it? So one of our main concerns and one of our scientific research projects is the degradation of the wreck itself. Because while the Titanic was made of some of the best materials of its day, it doesn't mean it lasts forever. We're able to talk a little bit about how difficult it is to dive on the Titanic, and a big portion of that is mainly based on what the ocean's elements can do to even things such as hardened steel. The Marconi room will be the focus of the 2020 expedition, which on the next slide, I'd like to outline for you guys in a bit more detail. So on the far right, we have the Marconi, and the Marconi is a wireless telegraph. And I know the first question I asked myself was, well, what does that mean? Well, at the time, the Marconi was the most sophisticated radio for wireless transmission of messages. So what it really means is it was the iPhone 11 of its time. This was used to send messages, to send news, to send gossip to and from shore, and also to and from other vessels. And while this is sort of what everyone was doing day to day, it had a much more important function. The Marconi was the last resort if the Titanic ever needed to call for help. And that is why the Marconi is so important today. Once the iceberg was struck by the Titanic, the operators used the Marconi to reach out to any vessel that would hear them in the hopes that people would be able to come and rescue some of the passengers. It is our firm belief that without the Marconi, there would not have been 700 plus survivors from that tragedy, and we would have no record and a lot less information about what had happened, and we wouldn't be able to learn from it, and we wouldn't be able to share these incredible people's stories. So, if I haven't sold you on this yet, maybe you don't think a radio is too exciting. However, there's a little rule breaking that goes on here that I think people should be aware of. There's 2 gentlemen that were tasked with operating the Marconi wireless on the ship for the entire journey. And these 2 men were certainly skilled operators, but the Marconi, being such a fancy machine, had a rule book. And the rule book told them, if something breaks, this needs to be brought back into shore, we need to bring in the experts, and they'll fix the radio. Well, that did happen. On the way out, there was found to be some issues with the transmission mechanism of the Marconi. And while these 2 gentlemen were certainly nice guys, they thought, well, that's not safe. We should do something about this. So they broke the rules. They worked on the radio on their own. And because of that, the transmission mechanism was consistent with how it was meant to be. And while that was all well and good for transmitting news and gossip, it also may be that exact reason that we had survivors of the Titanic and they were able to make that heroic call. So these men, in our opinion, are heroes, and the Marconi gives us a way to not only tell their story, but tie these 2 gentlemen to generations of people who survived the Titanic and all of their descendants. On the far right here, you can see an artist's rendering of the radio and its size. And on the left, you can see some of the tools that we intend to use. After about a year of planning and a lot of outside input and a lot of experts weighing in, we've created tools that, if you're able to zoom in, you can see are more like surgical hands. These tools will be able to reach down in through that hole in the roof that we talked about and actually extract the Marconi from those holes alone. So we'll be doing minimal evasive operations on the ship, leaving it intact, but being able to recover something that's so important for us to tell the legacy to people like you for generations to come. So we're very excited about this in 2020. And after this expedition, we plan to conserve the Marconi with teams including Jeffrey, that you'll meet in a minute, and tour it around the world and hopefully be able to show it to all of you firsthand at some point in your life. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Mr. Golden. Rory's a modern day explorer with tons of Titanic experience, and he's got some great stories that he'd like to share with you all. Rory?
Hi, everybody. Hello from Ireland, the country where Titanic was built in Belfast, sailed from Belfast and called into Cork or Cove, Queenstown, which is the last place it stopped before the tragedy took place. I've been very lucky to have been to the Titanic twice. I've been on 2 missions. The first mission was the one that we found some really exciting things, and I'm going to tell you all about those. But I've been diving for over 40 years, and I love being under the sea. And that photograph there you see on the screen is actually me in the water above the Titanic, not down as far as the Titanic, but I was filming the subs as they were going down to the Titanic that particular day. So let's go straight into it. And can we have the next slide, please? So what's it like to actually dive to the Titanic? Well, you get into these small submersibles. They're very, very small. Only 3 of you can squash into them. And you start to go down to the bottom of the ocean. It takes 2.5 hours to get there. That's how deep it is. 2.5 miles or nearly 4 kilometers below the surface of the ocean. And you go through all these feelings of amazement and sadness, and you also get really, really cold when you get to the bottom. When you get into the beginning, you're really hot. When you get to the bottom, you're freezing. But when you get to the bottom, it's so dark and so amazing. And actually the pressure is huge, but you don't feel the pressure because it's like being in an airplane. But outside, the water pressure is so strong that it's 400 bar or 6,000 pounds a square inch, or it's like 171 elephants all standing on your head. Now, what does that mean? Well, let me give you an example. You see that cup? That's your ordinary polystyrene cup. We put these in baskets outside the submarines, and when they come back to the surface, having been to the bottom, that's how much they have shrunk down to. That's the type of pressure that happens to things down there. So, without going into any more detail, let's describe what it's like to be on the bottom. You're going in through the dark, looking into the gloom, and then you see shapes starting to appear, and a wall of steel rises in front of you, and you see rivets and you see porthole windows. And the visibility is amazing because the lights in the submersibles are shining on the wreck. And when you come up and look down, you actually see all those amazing images that people have seen in magazines and films and books. You see the fallen mast where the lookout was. You see a lifeboat davit, the crane that let the lifeboats off. You see the area where the ship's wheel was, the telemotor. There's nothing left of the whole wheelhouse or bridge area, just that little solitary telemotor. And what I'm going to do now is let you see how we actually found the telemotor. You say, what's the telemotor? The telemotor is what drove the big rudder of the ship. It steered the ship, and attached to that was something called the helm. And the helm was the wheel of the Titanic. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen there, that's me holding it. And on the bottom photograph, you can see what it would have looked like. That's from a ship that's in Liverpool. But let's look at the video now, and you can see those robot arms, which Bretton was talking about, picking up the wheel of the Titanic. And this was in August 2000. And this was an amazing discovery to find. You can see the robotic arm there is holding on to it. Yeah, that's me talking in the background. So the robot arm picked up the wheel. And what I had seen was, you could just see that semicircular shape, like a half shape. I saw that sticking out of a pile of rubbish and dirt and sand. And I realized that was something not man-made. Nature doesn't have natural shapes. So this is afterwards when the sub came back to the surface. and the helm was sitting in the basket in front of the submarine. And you can see a very young Rory coming up in a moment talking about it.
This was lying loose, and we believe this is the ship's wheel from the main bridge. So that is quite a find, and there's still some timber on it, as you can see. So that was a real baby to get at the very end of the dive. The very end of the dive, as we were coming home, there it was.
This is the oddball out. This is the one with the A-frame stand.
I mean, that's exactly. I was right, because I saw the photographs. A-frame, the bar running in to the channel motor, right?
Exactly.
I couldn't believe it when I saw it. I just kept thinking, no, we couldn't be that lucky. So then we came up along the starboard officer's deck, saw Captain Smith's quarters, and then saw that loose lamp, and then we were just heading along towards where the expansion joint, and that's when I saw it was right in at the side. I just saw the hub just sticking out.
Well spotted. It's good. It's good. That's a lovely piece. Look at that.
I mean, that's like the heart of the ship, nearly.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So that was one of the most amazing things of my life to have done. And what's interesting is that the man who was at that steering wheel was a man called Robert Hitchens. He was only 29, and he had to tell about what happened the night of the tragedy. And when he was giving his testimony in the court, he said, "I heard the telegraph ring when 3 gongs came from the lookout. The 3 warning bells, iceberg right ahead. And I was given the order, hard to starboard, and I repeated the order, hard to starboard, the helm is hard over, sir." I have become friends with Robert Hitchens' great-grandson called Simon Medhurst, and he lives in England, and one day I hope to meet him. So all I can say to you all is, I never thought I could get somewhere like the Titanic. I never thought I could take part in other expeditions, but I always dreamed about these things, and it happened to me. So what I would say to you all out there, follow your dreams, because you never know, one day it'll come true for you. I'm now going to hand you over to the next man who's going to talk, and he was actually in that video a few moments ago, Bill Sauter, famous historian. He was there with me that night of the wheel find. So over to you, Bill.
Thanks very much, Rory. Those were exciting days. It's just amazing to look at those old pictures and think, wow, we did that. We brought all that stuff back. It's amazing, even all this time later. Well, as Rory mentioned, my name is Bill Sauter, and I'm the Director of Titanic Research for RMST. Basically, what I do is keep track of things and information that pertain to Titanic that would be of interest to the company or to historians or to the public in general. It's an odd field to get into. I was very lucky. Some of you may have heard of the artist Ken Marshall. He happened to live right down the road from me. And when Ballard discovered the wreck, he gave a bunch of photographs to Ken and said, "Ken, can you identify them?" Well, Ken said yes, and realized there were several thousand. And so he gave me a call and said, "Bill, can you come down to a Mexican restaurant and we'll kind of go through all these pictures?" And we did. And that was sort of my introduction to Titanic. Shortly after that, Jim Cameron did his film, and I was brought on board for a technical consultant. And then a few years after that, RMST asked me to join them for the 2000 mission, which you saw in the video. And ever since then, I've been pretty heavily involved with the Titanic wreck. Next slide. A lot of what we bring up is random. It can be just about anything. Titanic is one of the few wrecks that has broken open and completely spilled her contents. So as you travel over the sand, you don't know what you're going to see. It's all jumbled up. Some of it are personal effects, like hair combs. Some of them are ship's fittings, forks, knives, spoons. As a matter of fact, there's this tiny, delicate little teacup that was used in first class that came to rest on a 50-ton boiler. Just total contrast, totally random, total chaos down there, but very, very interesting. Probably the most rewarding things to bring up are passenger effects, especially if you can identify them, because otherwise the Titanic is just a collection of things but no real story. By being able to find a particular passenger's baggage, we can now say, oh, this is who he or she was. This is what he or she was doing. This is why it was important for that person to be on Titanic. One of those passengers was a second-class German gentleman named Franz Pullbaum. I shouldn't say he was second class. I should say he was traveling in second class. We found a couple of pieces of baggage that belonged to him, and they were very revealing, very helpful in piecing together who the man was. In the next slide, we'll see a couple of the items. You'll notice in the lower center is a picture of a steamship. Now, that's not Titanic. That's a French ship called the Rochambeau. She was a first-class French ship. He went over to Europe on the direction of his employer. His employer wanted him to put together some amusement park rides that were being designed. But since he was in Paris, he was going to do some sightseeing, and you'll notice he stopped by the Arc de Triomphe, which you see there right in the middle, and the Notre Dame Cathedral down on the left. Now, I mentioned he was not an American citizen. At this point, he'd been living in the United States for several years, but he was not actually an American citizen. Before he left, he filled out what's called a Declaration of Intent. You can see that. That's the document on the far right, the yellow one. What happens was, since he was not an American citizen, there was a possibility that when he re-entered the country, he might have to go through immigration processing again in Ellis Island, and that would be an extreme nuisance. This Declaration of Intent showed that he had been a resident in the United States and that he was exempt from further questioning at Ellis Island. Now, his employer was a company called the Witching Waves. And amusement parks at this time were just as important back then as they are today. They were extremely, extremely popular. And what it consisted of, and I got a video of it as a matter of fact, is it was kind of like bumper cars, but the cars themselves didn't have motors in them. They were more like the push carts that you would see at the grocery store. Those push carts actually are on a flexible steel track, and you had no control over where you went, and most of the fun was bumping into other people, by accident. We brought up a couple of things pertaining to his employer, Witching Waves. One of them was a season's pass, which you see there on the left. This is basically a get-in-free ticket. The item on the right is very interesting because this is a stock certificate for Pullbaum's company, the Witching Waves. Very often, companies don't give a cash bonus for a job well done. They'll give something better. They'll give stock. Now, of course, at this point, Pullbaum could have sold the stock for money. But the idea was to hold on to the stock, work hard, increase the value of the company, and therefore increase the value of the stock certificate. I think that's really just about it for the paper items. So I'm going to hand this over to Jeff Taylor. He's our collections manager, and he's the gentleman who actually takes care of our physical artifacts, keeps them safe, makes sure they're ready to be seen by the public. So Jeff, if you're ready.
Thank you, Bill. Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Taylor. And my job is called a collections manager. Now, what that means is I take care of collections. And there's a lot of different kinds of collections, like an art museum where I worked at prior to this job. I took care of paintings and statues and very different kinds of objects. Maybe if you've been to a zoo to see animals, even a zoo has a collections manager who takes care of animals, but it's still a collection. Now I'm really lucky because I get to work with a collection of artifacts that have been brought up from the bottom of the ocean and once made up the magnificent ship, the Titanic, and lots of personal items and possessions of the people who rode on that ship. So I think I have a pretty great job. I'd like to show you some of the things that we just talked about with Mr. Sauter, and then some other items about the ship. Now, as Mr. Sauter told us, there are postcards of Paris, the ship that Mr. Polbaum rode on to get to Europe, personal papers that talk about him wanting to become an American citizen. And as you look at this paper, notice that you can still see pencil, actual writing. That's pretty remarkable that after all these years and after being 2.5 miles under the ocean, we can still recover something as fragile as paper and see the colors and the words and the actual writing that someone did with their own hand. And it's something we can see and enjoy today. See the colors on the stock certificate? They really came out well after being underwater for over 85 years. Here was the witching waves items. Something really interesting that you guys might like is that Franz Polbaum had a toy airplane in his luggage. And this is a cardboard box that the airplane came in. We think that Franz had a son back in the United States, a young boy, and he possibly bought this airplane as a souvenir or a gift to take home to his son after his business trip was finished. This was an instruction sheet that came with the airplane. Now, how did all this paper survive under 2.5 miles of water for 85 years? How does that happen? Well, the answer is in the luggage. This is a leather suitcase. This did not belong to Franz, but he had something very similar. The leather of this suitcase, through the tanning process, there were chemicals that repelled small microorganisms that would otherwise eat the paper, eat the wood, and eat cloth. The leather actually protected these items and let them survive so many years under so much water and so much pressure. So it's thanks to these leather bags that we have so many treasures to share with you. Now, Franz also had these three-dimensional objects in his luggage. A tool handle, we don't know from what, because the top of the tool has eroded away or been dissolved by the seawater, but we do still have the wooden handle. He also traveled with 3 distinct pencils. Each pencil had a very specific purpose. One was used to draw plans, so he could make sketches. One was a white crayon that he could actually draw upon blueprints and make notations. And the last one is something that he would use to draw on wood if he had to make a mark where to saw or maybe drill a hole. So even though there's 3 pencils, they all had a very specific purpose. And this shows you that he was on a business trip and he had things he had to do. And these were all found in his luggage. Finally, there's something that you might recognize here. The circular metal case has a long cloth tape coming out of it with lots of regular numbers. This is a measuring tape. You might recognize it from similar measuring tapes that we use today. This also was something Franz traveled with, and it was part of his work assignment. And we recovered all of this from his luggage. So artifacts like this let us tell a person's story. All of this paper, the pencils, the tape measure, and many other things gave us a wonderful picture of Franz. We could study about what kind of a person he was, maybe what his family was like. But in addition to passengers, we also have many parts of the ship. You can see this gold chandelier that was in a first-class smoking or a sitting room. Look at how the parts of the chandelier are twisted and broken. That shows you how powerful the wreck and the fall to the bottom of the ocean was. This is very strong, heavy metal, but the forces twisted it. You can also see in the back a cooking pot that was used in the kitchens of the Titanic to prepare food for the many passengers on board. You can see how this on the ocean floor began to erode and crack and break apart from the acids in the ocean floor and the pressure that was on top of it. You might also recognize these two handles, hot and cold, most likely from a passenger's bathroom sink area. Also, the ceramic hot and cold have survived very nice, almost like they'd never even been underwater. There are also parts of the ship such as wrenches, specific wrenches that were meant to drive the engineering parts, the engines of the ship, and other things that they needed to keep lights and the facilities of the ship running. And finally, this is a window or porthole on the ship that has survived and was brought up from the ocean floor. One of Titanic's portholes. Finally, what I'd like to end with is a very important object. This was one of the ship's bells. It was located in the crow's nest. And on the night the Titanic hit the iceberg, the lookouts in the crow's nest would have seen the iceberg. A gentleman by the name of Frederick Fleet would have rang this bell in alarm, trying to warn the captain and the officers that danger was ahead. And this was the bell that he rang to warn everybody on the ship. These are just a small number of the artifacts that we have from the Titanic. And we only talked about one passenger today, Franz Polbaum, out of 1,500. Think how many more stories there are to tell. And that is our mission, and that's what makes us so happy, is that we can use these artifacts to tell these stories and keep history moving. And it's really a wonderful thing we get to do, and we're so happy that we can share it with you. I'm going to turn this back to Bretton now. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jeffrey, and thanks, everyone. So really quickly, before we go to Q&A, I just wanted to thank each of you for your time today. I'm happy that we were able to bring some of the deep sea explorers, researchers, and our conservators over to you. And I just wanted to let you guys know that this is a large community of people that are working in the ocean's depths. As technology advances, we're able to go further than ever before. We can learn fascinating things, and new life is discovered every day. So as everything moves forward, these oceans are becoming more important and people are becoming more aware. And as time goes on, there continues to be opportunities for people just like you to make a difference as modern day explorers. So with that, I'd like to turn it over for questions.
All right. Wow. Thank you so much. I feel like I got goosebumps about 3 different times during that presentation. What a great overview of what you're doing. How fascinating. I know we have a lot of students who are very eager to ask questions of this whole group. So why don't we dive right into it? I want to start with Ruby and Francis. Ruby and Francis, if you want to unmute yourselves, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Ruby, you can start.
All those sea creatures moving inside the wreckage.
Try it slower and louder.
All those sea creatures moving inside the wreckage.
All right, well, that's maybe a question for Rory. Are there sea creatures moving about inside the wreckage? Yeah, just a second, Rory. Can you, when you were down on the wreck, did you notice any sea creatures? Let me see if I can.
Okay, I'm back. Yeah, absolutely. There are many, many deep sea creatures down there. They live under incredible pressure, which I talked about earlier. And you can see one of the most common things you see on the wreck are small little crabs. They're completely white and they're blind, and they just move very slowly all around the wreck looking for food to eat. The other thing I've seen down there is something called a rat-tailed fish. And a rat-tailed fish, they're about this long, about 3 feet long, 1 meter long. And they have huge eyes. And even though it's pitch black down there, they can sometimes pick up light from something called bioluminescence. And bioluminescence is something that small other creatures make artificially. They make a light to either attract others to them or to act as bait so they can catch other fish. So there's a whole world of creatures down there in the bottom of the ocean, like crabs and also like the fish and starfish and many other creatures that I don't have the names of. But yes, there are animal life down there, and it's incredible to think that in that depth of the ocean, with all that pressure, life goes on in the deep. This is World Oceans Day. Our planet is the blue planet, and we only know a fraction of what's going down in our oceans. We need to explore more.
All right, Ruby and Francis, great question. I'm going to come back to you in just a little bit to give you a chance to ask a second question. But I want to bring in one of our other students who's watching. Lysandra, I want to go to you. If you want to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. In an emergency, if the submarines have a malfunction, what would you do?
I think that's for me again. Well, the first thing I'll say is that there has never been any accidents or incidents with the submersibles, either the French Nautil or the 2 Russian subs, the Mir 1 and the Mir 2, and even only last year, Victor Vescovo made a dive in his new submersible. There have never been any accidents or incidents. There have been a couple of small incidents, but there's never been an emergency. So what you need to know is that if there is an emergency, they, for example, say your power runs out, the batteries run down, and they can't motor back to the surface. They can ditch the weights that keep them down there. The Russian subs have lead shot weight. They can ditch that, and it becomes buoyant. They can come back to the surface. Another thing that might go wrong is you mightn't be watching the carbon dioxide in the submarine. Now, what's carbon dioxide? When we breathe in air, we breathe in oxygen, nitrogen and oxygen. Air is 79% nitrogen and it's 21% oxygen. We breathe in 21%, we breathe out 16.5%. And 3.5% is carbon dioxide, which has to be replenished. And you have bottles in the subs that put more oxygen in. There are special sensors inside the sub, and if you don't watch those, the carbon dioxide level can increase and make you sleepy. And that has happened to people sometimes until they realize that they need to put more oxygen in. But the main emergency is if something goes wrong, the subs can get back to the surface. They are very well maintained and serviced. They have to be. So that is the situation in an emergency.
All right, great question, Lysandra. Thank you so much. Matthew, I'm going to go over to you. Go ahead and ask your question.
So when you go down to get the telegraph machine, if you find anything else, will you bring that up too? Like take that up to the surface too?
Sure, Matthew. So we do intend to bring up a couple of other items. And as Jeffrey said, there's a lot of passenger stories and interesting things that we can learn from those items. The Marconi telegraph is really our priority this year, but we also have a short list of things that are going to help us tell more stories or some things that we think can give us more information about the ship itself and sort of what happened that night. So yes, we definitely will bring up some other items. The Marconi, it's just the first time anything will ever have come out from the inside of the ship. So that's why it's a big deal for us this year.
All right, great question, Matthew. Thank you. Let's go over to Callie. Callie, if you want to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Are you bringing more coal up? Are you bringing more coal up, or is it all gone? Because my mom has 2 pieces, and I would really like one.
Did you get all that?
You said the coal, sorry?
She said, are you bringing more coal up to the surface, or is it all gone? Because my mom has 2 pieces, excuse me, and I would really like one too.
So Callie, we'll reach out to Tim after this and we'll see if we can get you a piece of coal. But yeah, we definitely intend to have some going forward.
Very cool. Very cool. All right, so let's go over to Alexa. Where are you, Alexa? If we can see if I can find you. If you want to unmute yourself, go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. With the information or artifacts you found, were you able to contact any of the passengers' family members to tell them more of what happened?
Yes, so generally we do try to. There's some very interesting stories about that. I think Bill Souter will probably give us one example after this if he doesn't mind. But there's been numerous accounts where those families will come to the exhibitions or to the lab and sort of have a moment with the item itself. And, you know, interestingly enough, they like to share information with us as well. So it's not just us teaching them things, it's them teaching us more and giving us the stories of their families. Bill Souter, do you have a favorite one that you'd like to share?
Gee, there's, I would say 3 or 4, maybe 5 passenger families that we've been able to contact through finding artifacts down on the seabed. Pocket watches, for instance, they're usually very easy to identify because they have the name engraved, and because they're made out of gold, they tend to be very durable. I know we had an arrangement with one family where we brought the watch back and we lent it to the family, and they kept it until the last natural heir died and it returned to RMS.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, that was a really great question. Let's go to Sarah. Sarah, if you want to unmute yourself, please go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, yeah. Even if you can get into the Marconi suite, do you think that the telegraph machine would be intact enough to like study?
Sure. So we have some decent imagery over the last couple of years as to what's going on. And it does indeed look like it's still intact. To be honest, things change every day. So when we get there, hopefully in August, it could be in a different situation than it was in the prior year or in the prior 5 years that we have images. So it's certainly a hopeful approach for us. And when we get there, we have to assess it. But it's a great question because of the pressure and everything that Rory discussed and the degradation. That's always a concern. And that kind of drives us to try and do it as soon as we can.
Let me pass that along to Jeffrey too, if he's still on. I wanted to ask if you get, when you get a artifact that is sort of in some has seen some significant wear and tear, what are some of the things that you can do to help preserve it?
You know, that's a great question. And it all depends upon what the material of the item is that it's made out of. And then you have various different approaches. In most cases, metal, the biggest problem that's happened is it's absorbed, you know, a lot of salt water. And that salt water, as long as it's under the ocean, under in that cold temperature and under all that pressure, it's fine. But once you bring it to the surface, you've now subjected it to oxygen. And without that pressure and the coldness of the depths, immediately the oxygen is going to start to have an adverse reaction with many types of metal, and corrosion and breakdown will begin. So what you need to do is send pieces of metal to conservator labs, where they basically keep it in baths where the salt it generally comes out little by little. Then you change the water to fresh water, more salt comes out. In some cases, they have to do a procedure called electrolysis, where they actually connect electrodes to an object and try and speed up that process to create a more chemical and stable balance for the artifact. And once you can stabilize it, it will become, you know, able to survive in oxygen, and just as you saw today, we can keep them. Other objects, for instance, paper and textiles, sometimes you actually need to put them in a second bath, again, of clean water, and then you freeze dry them so that you can vacuum some of the dirt and the particles off the surface. It really depends upon the material that we have, and what we do is based on material and makeup of options. We consult relevant conservators who are experienced working in a lot of different materials, and they make the best judgment and assessment of what we should do. And so we really rely on those experts to help us out. But there's a lot of people working in those fields who have a lot of expertise and information to help us.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for the great question. Let's go over to Dina, who I know has a question on behalf of one of her students. Dina, go ahead.
I'm actually not asking a question. I just want to make a comment that I've been to Belfast and I went to visit the museum. It was phenomenal. I did that afternoon tea, the Sunday afternoon tea. It was elegant. Everything about that museum was perfect. It was beautiful. I spent hours there. It was so great, and I recommend it to everyone. What a great experience I had there. I just wanted you to know you did a great job.
Dina, thanks for sharing so much. Let's go, why don't we go back to Ruby and Francis? I told you I'd give you another chance to ask a question. Go for it, please.
Where is the Carpathia now?
All right, so the question was, where is the Carpathia now?
Mm-hmm.
It's at the bottom of the ocean, I'm afraid. It was sunk by a German U-boat in the First World War, and it's lying in water about 300 miles or thereabouts off the south coast of Ireland. And it's in about 150 to 200 meters depth, I think, but it might be a bit deeper than that. I'm not quite sure. But I think Bretton can tell you more about that, because the company actually owns that wreck.
Okay, great. Rory, did you say Jeffrey might have more to add about that?
I think Bretton or Bill might be able to answer that in better detail than me.
Sure, Bill, you want to go ahead and I'll round it out?
Sure. RMS Incorporated did briefly own rights to the wreck of the Carpathia. I think that was about 2004, right in there. And we actually did mount an expedition to the wreck, and we recovered, I'd say, about 30 to 40 objects. But for various reasons, RMST sold their interests in Carpathia to another company. So at the moment, RMST does not have any connection with the wreck directly anymore.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Bretton, did you have something to add to that, or?
No, I think that's
okay.
Good. Unless there's further questions about the ship itself, we do have a little bit of knowledge there.
Okay, great. Ruby, Francis, thanks for those great questions. Lysandra, let's go back to you. Do you have another question you'd like to ask?
Yeah. I want to ask if there was anything really out of the ordinary that struck you and like kind of caught your eye.
Sure, Lysandra, are you asking Rory about when he was down at the Titanic, or are you asking Jeffrey about some of the things that have been brought up from the Titanic?
Things that been brought up.
All right, well, maybe Jeffrey, do you want to ask that? Is there anything really unusual that has been brought up as part of your collection?
You know, there are some unusual items that are in a different part of our building where they're being stored and refrigerated, but I can tell you that some of the kind of cool things that have been brought up are actually a jar of olives, like that are still suspended in olive oil. And, you know, you can hold up the jar and see the olives. Unfortunately, we didn't get them out today, but there are things, some food items. There are some olives and some olive pits. There are types of oils that you can still see that have separated in a bottle. So interesting foodstuffs that you might think, wow, that has survived. We have, if we can walk over through the storage lab, and Catherine will show you some of our shelving where we have other parts of the ship and other types of artifacts. I don't know if they're necessarily strange on those food items, but if we stop sort of right in this area, these are very personal things. Like this is a very small, sweet porcelain dog holding a basket in its mouth. This is something very intimate and very personal that one of the passengers owned. We don't know who, because it was recovered on the ocean floor. So I think these are very unique and very special things. We also have small egg cups. These designs, this actually, you can't see it really well, but it has I think a running chicken design on it. The running chicken was not a design used on Titanic, so it was not from the ship. This probably means it was in a passenger's personal possession from maybe their travels, a souvenir or something that they would put their egg in. I love these kinds of artifacts that give a little more personality and history of a person.
Absolutely.
I think
Thank
that's
you.
a pretty good sort of overview of some of the neat things. There's many, many more we can go on about, but I'll stop right there.
Yeah, thanks for showing us so many more things.
If I can come in now, I think one of the most amazing things on the 2000 expedition, and I'd like to hand over to Bill in a moment, was the recovery of Adolf Salfeld's perfume samples in the little leather sachet. And the night that it was opened in the laboratory, when, despite that incredible pressure, the glass files of the perfume had survived. And when we took the stoppers out of the glass files, all these amazing aromas permeated around the laboratory. And I've seen a video of Bill describing that, and the way he describes it is amazing. And I'd like him to take over from there and tell everybody a little bit about Adolf Salfeld and that reaction to the perfumes.
Well, Salfeld was a perfumier who was traveling to Europe to get the latest scents, that is to say, odors, fragrances, from France for his perfume company. And perfumes in 1912 are pretty different from what we have today. Today, they tend to be very earthy and organic smelling. In 1912, they tended to be pure floral essence. In other words, what you would do is you would take a violet or a rose or a heavily scented flower and distill it. It's like a super concentrated smell of pure roses. And what was a little creepy about the whole thing, we don't usually think about it, but when we bring up metal objects or wooden objects, they smell. They smell awful. They smell like death because they're infested with all this bacteria, and we've never encountered it. You know, as human beings living on the surface, we've never smelled that kind of smell. And the lab is kind of unpleasant to be around at that time with all that mucky smell. And all of a sudden, this wonderful smell just came out of nowhere. And it certainly took me by surprise. I had no idea that they had brought up perfume vials. I honestly don't think anybody knew it. We couldn't believe what this wonderful smell was and where it was coming from. Eventually, we tracked it down and found it was the vials. They had, I don't exactly want to say what cracked open, but they had separated enough so that the odor came out. And it was wonderful, completely unsurprised. It was like literally the fragrance of heaven opened up, and it's like, wow, that's beautiful. So,
how cool. Great.
Hey, Gil, if I can just jump in right here, timing allowed us to actually reach and grab some of these vials. And I can attest to you, I can tell you all it's very true. There is a very beautiful floral scent, even right now, coming out of these vials here that you can see. We have 3 of them. One of them still has the outside metal casing that protected the vial itself. There would have been a bottle, a bottom metal casing and a top metal casing that would have protected the entire bottle. There's also a small remnant on this vial of a paper label. Each of these vials were labeled with the scent that was inside. Now these stoppers have a glass stopper that goes down into the liquid such that you could pull that stopper out and apply it to your body. And so we're very, very fortunate to have a set of these vials, and they still smell sweet and delightful even to this day.
That is amazing. Thank you so much for finding those, Jeffrey. That's really incredible. What a cool thing to see. We're already a little over on time, but I want to give a couple more people questions to ask, if that's okay with you guys. I want to jump to Matthew. I'm going to unmute you. Matthew, go ahead and ask your question.
So I saw that the telegraph machine was like on a wall. So if it's still on a wall now, how are you going to get it off the wall without damaging it?
Sure, Matthew. So actually, given all the pressure and the bacteria that everyone's been talking about, the wall behind the telegraph is completely gone. So the only thing holding it in place where it should have been on the wall is the metal cords associated with it. So we'll clip those metal cords very carefully at the top while we have something to hold the telegraph piece from the bottom, and then that will lift it up through the roof itself. So that wall is completely on, and if we can, we'll try and get a picture over to Tim to show you that it's sort of suspended in the middle of the water by itself.
How cool. Great question, Matthew. Very cool. Callie, let's go to you. Do you have a question you'd like to ask? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Are you using ROVs or AUVs?
Great question.
I'll tell you what, Kelly, that's a great question. And until recently, I wouldn't have been able to answer it. But we're using ROVs for this mission. We'll actually have at least 2 working at the same time. One will be doing more of the filming and sort of making sure that everything is going appropriately. And the other one will be operating the tools to recover the artifacts as well as the Marconi.
Bretton, real quick, can you tell us the difference between the two?
Sure. The ROV is a remote operated vehicle. It's sort of the jack of all trades, I would call it. And this is less technical, so I'm sure Rory can pitch in. But it does our filming. It has the manipulators, which are the arms that help us to pick things up or to use tooling to get into spaces we need. The AUV is more of a scanning vehicle. It's autonomous and it passes over things. When we made that sonar map that I showed you guys, that was sort of black and white and it looked like it glowed a little bit. That's something typically that an AUV could do, is make numerous passes over a site and then create imagery associated with it. Rory, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, the main difference between an ROV and an ROV has cables all the way to the surface, which control the operation of it. And an AUV is like an underwater drone, where it's remotely controlled through the water.
Okay, thank you, Callie, for that wonderful question. I would like to go to Alexa. Alexa, let me find you on here. Alexa, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question.
Thank you. Were there any bodies left at the Titanic wreck site, and can you find out their backstory?
So Rory can speak firsthand, but due to the conditions, mainly the pH of the water and the fact that the mud is caustic, we have never come across any human remains at the Titanic. All of the stories that we're learning about and coming from comes from more investigative work from people like Jeffrey and Bill, who study the items specifically themselves and try to tie it to people on the ship through various ways.
Yeah, it's a question that I'm always asked, and the answer I always give is that, remember, most people who died, sadly, of the Titanic tragedy died on the surface, and they didn't die even from drowning. They would have died from the cold. The water was so cold, and there has never been any bodies discovered around the wreck site because the bodies have dissolved a long, long, long time ago. So that is the answer to the question. We've never seen anything down there. In all the years of underwater exploration, there's never been any human remains seen on the wreck site.
Okay, great question. Let's go to Sarah real quick. Sarah, do you have a question you'd like to ask? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, if this mission is successful, what's next? If the mission is unsuccessful, do you try again or just move on to something else?
That's a great question, Sarah. If the mission is unsuccessful, it could be a lot of things. It could be too dangerous to get into the Marconi room to pull the radio out. We may determine that damage would be done to the wreck that we're not comfortable doing. So there's going to be some balance when we get out there to find out. Assuming it is successful, it will certainly be a big day for us. I think the focus will be to get the Marconi out to the world so everyone can come see it firsthand. So that's a big conservation effort. And after that, we'd really like to understand better what the degradation means for the entire wreck itself and what that means from a timing standpoint in terms of how long things will be in place and what sort of needs to be addressed next. So it would be a little bit of thinking bigger picture afterwards, but certainly it would be a great win for us, and I think a great win for most of the public.
All right, Sarah, thank you for that wonderful question. We're already 15 minutes over. I want to really thank our guests for sticking with us and answering more questions today. I think we're going to have to stop the questions here. But I want to close just by saying thank you so much to Bretton and his colleagues for joining us today. It was a fascinating presentation. I want to thank our international YouTube live stream audience for joining us as well. This is just the beginning of a full lineup of Oceans Week events this week. Tomorrow, we'll be taking a closer look at seashells and unlocking some of the secrets of the Galapagos Islands. And on Wednesday, we'll be connecting with Fabian Cousteau to learn about efforts to protect sea turtles in the Caribbean. So there's so much more to go. Check out the complete list of upcoming Oceans Week events at athome.reachtheworld.org. And as a farewell, I'm going to unmute everybody who is on our call, or you might have to unmute yourselves, and we'll count to 3 and we'll say goodbye and thank you to all of our Titanic experts who joined us today. So to all of our students who are on the call, would you please unmute yourself? And I can help you as well. And on the count of 3, let's all say goodbye and thank you. 1, 2, 3.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Goodbye and thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you all. Happy World Oceans Day.
World Oceans Day.